advertising was so much fun because we were the first company to use rock and roll music. Now you can imagine San Francisco rock and roll, Bill Graham Auditorium. I got to work with the Jefferson Airplane and the Sopwith Camel and Sly and the Family Stone. I mean, I thought I died and went to heaven. I was having so much fun.
Tom Kasten, thank you so much for joining me on 20 Minute Leaders. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be with you, Michael.
I am so excited to, take nuggets out of your 34 wonderful years at Levi's as a senior executive, president of youth wear apparel and men's jeans and women's clothing, and all sorts of different extraordinary things that I take for granted when I walk into the store, and I believe that I'm wearing Levi's jeans right now. So I'm extremely excited to hear about what it means to be a senior executive at such a company, and a little bit about retail, a little bit about fashion, and then do this drastic transition more to public service, being a two-time mayor of Hillsborough, as well as serving on a numerous school public organizations, boards of Jewish organizations. So Tom, I rambled enough. Take it away. Who are you, and how do you get started with Levi's?
It's interesting story. It goes back quite a few years. I was in grad school getting my MBA, and in one of my classes, the professor would bring in CEOs of existing companies. And one of the CEOs that came in was Walter Haas Jr., who was the CEO of Levi Strauss Company.
Wow.
He was the only CEO that we had that actually talked about values, not just about, profit and revenue.
I love it.
And so I went up to him afterwards and I made that observation with him. I said, you're the only one who's talked about the importance of values and culture in an organization. And he handed me his business card and he said, see me when you graduate. And so I did. I ended up joining Levi's. I was interviewing with 3 different companies, but Levi's, it was always sort of in my heart. San Francisco company, I don't have to move anywhere. Consumer product, which is what I knew I wanted to get into because I'm fascinated by consumer behavior. And so that's where the love began, if you will. And I joined them before they had any kind of training program. But what they did is they rotated me through various departments. And I sort of fell in love with product development. And so not that I studied it in school. I never had a class on product development. But when I joined Levi's, they had just reached $100 million in revenue. And I thought, oh, my gosh, I'm joining such a big company. And I had interviewed with Ford Motor Company and a tech company. And I decided that I wanted to do this. It was right up my alley. My first job was in market research, which is a great place to start because it gives you an overview of the company and the markets, the consumer.
Right.
And I then did a stint in advertising. Advertising was so much fun because we were the first company to use rock and roll music. Now you can imagine San Francisco rock and roll, Bill Graham Auditorium. I got to work with the Jefferson Airplane and the Sopwith Camel and Sly and the Family Stone. I mean, I thought I died and went to heaven. I was having so much fun.
Amazing.
From there, I went into product development and really kind of found my niche and rose through the ranks, so to speak. Somebody once said of my career at Levi's, he said, Tom could never hold a job because he changed every 2 years. And so I rose up through the ranks. My first division president job at a very young age, I might add. I thought wow, I'm a division president. I'm still wet behind the ears. Was in the youth wear business, which is a great training ground, really. We were not particularly dominant in kids wear, but it was good training for me. And then I became president of the biggest division in the company, the jeans division. And
Yes,
I took that to its first $1 billion, and I thought, my God,
really.
$1 billion business. I can't believe this. And these were fully integrated businesses. So I had production, manufacturing, sales, finance, everything. It was like running a company. And
Okay, Tom, I have to stop you there
yeah,
because first of all, I'm bowing down. I think that for anytime I get to speak to somebody who grew a business to $1 billion business, putting even aside that it's a business that probably every person in the world knows the brand and can associate the quality and the youthfulness with the brand. But talk to me about what it's like to take ownership of Levi's jeans. One of the most probably popular clothing items in the world, Levi's jeans. And what is some of the thought process that you bring into this? How do you innovate within fashion and retail?
well, the first thought is, don't screw it up. It was, it was a tremendous responsibility, and I did feel the weight of responsibility because basically it was the engine that drove the company. Um, in having other jobs at Levi's, I learned the importance of listening to the consumer and the customer. Now, what's the difference? The consumer is the person who actually buys the product in the store and wears it. The customer is the retail store. You have to please the customer in order to get your product in front of the consumer. And then you better pay a lot of attention to the consumer.
Right.
Fortunately, in my role in market research, I did a lot of research among young people because that was our primary market. So I was at the Bill Graham Auditorium every Saturday talking to young kids who were wearing jeans. And so I was able to
Amazing.
translate that back into when I was running the men's product. And it's just really constantly keeping your ear to the market, listening to the customer, listening to the consumer, watching what your competitors are doing, and looking for those drivers that affect trends. Color. So I used to go to paint stores and look at the new color chips. I used to go to
Really?
museums to see what was being shown. Going to art galleries, you have to look very broadly to understand what are the trends that are driving consumer taste and behavior. When you start to understand that, you can begin to project and predict, not 100% all the time, but more successful than not. Um,
But it's even more responsibility than that because you're both assimilating to existing trends that you're observing, but you are creating a trend yourself. Levi's jeans is a movement, right? It's a trend, it's a community, it's a stamp that people want to adhere to. So it's not just the responsibility of meeting the expectations, but it's also creating those expectations for the next generation, right?
right. But also keeping the quality high. We were the number one brand by far. We're an iconic brand. It's often used generically. Hey, I got my Levi's on, and when you look at the product, they're not wearing Levi's jeans. We protected our trademark and our IP very, very carefully. There's a wonderful picture when the Berlin Wall fell of a large number of young people, teenagers, people and kids in their 20s, sitting on top of the Berlin Wall, every one of them wearing jeans. Now, they probably weren't all Levi's jeans, but we were well represented on that. And it was loved in the Eastern countries and in Russia, etc. Why? It stood for independence. It stood for the pioneering spirit. It stood for being able to be yourself. And so it was a highly coveted product all over the world. Um, when I moved over to women's wear, which was an interesting story that we don't have time for, but it became even more important to understand the consumer because women are very focused on fashion and they change their mind often, but they know exactly what they want. Men, I want a pair of jeans. This fits. Okay, I walk out the store. Women are very particular about the way the garment fits. And so I had to hone even further my instincts for listening to the customer, the retailer, and the consumer, and really understanding the women's brands and the women's business. There are far more brands in women's wear than there are in menswear. Um, So that was a very exciting time for me. When I took over that division, it was mostly men, and I thought, why are men so heavily involved in this? And so I started bringing in more women, and at the end, our division had like 5 men and 80 women in the headquarters. But it helped me understand how to move quickly because the women's business is a much faster business. The products change much more frequently. And I have to admit, I made more mistakes, or we made more mistakes because you can't be 100% perfect in terms of reading the fashion trends that are taking place. So
Tom, were you always interested in fashion growing up during your MBA?
Yes, I knew I wanted to go into a consumer business, and I actually thought about retail. I thought about going to New York and working for one of the large department stores. I had a professor who was really pushing me toward that. But I had grown up in Levi's. One of my dad's best friends was a Levi's salesman. And so when I had the opportunity to join Levi's, I knew exactly that's where I wanted to go. Sorry, Ford Motor Company, but that's the way it worked out. And it was a fabulous career because I never got bored. We were growing so fast that I always had these opportunities to move into different venues and different lines of business. When I became executive vice president of new business development, now I was talking about acquisitions and licensing, and that broadened again my perspective. And one of the jobs I ended up doing was running information technology for the United States. Why? Because they wanted a business person to run technology because they felt that it was important that whoever's running technology actually knew something about the business. And that was a lot of fun because I had to learn a lot very rapidly. So I remember a comment that one of my senior managers made. She came in and she closed the door and she said, "Tom, we're really glad you're here." And I said, "Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I know I have a lot to learn." She says, "Tom, don't worry about the technology. That's why we're here. We need you to teach us the business and to understand how the apparel business works," which is
Amazing.
what I did and which was a lot of fun.
Tom, I'd love to hear, obviously we can't, distill 34 years of experience in the retail apparel business into, a few minutes, but I'd love to hear some of your nuggets as to how you approached understanding consumer behavior. So we talked about, understanding trends, you going into the museums and the paint shops and seeing how do you actually then think more globally about, okay, making a change to the Levi's brand, that's a big deal, right?
Huge.
Deciding on how it's a huge deal. What does that thinking process look like? How do you validate a potential change in the design process, before you branch it out to, millions of people?
So this probably should not come as any surprise. First of all, we are an international brand, so I did travel the world, and I went to some of the leading apparel shows, like in Cologne, Germany, which was one of the largest shows, just to see what other brands were doing in other countries. I think the most important source for me for information was the sales clerk on the floor of a retail store. A lot of my colleagues would go visit the president of the store or the general merchandise manager. I wanted to talk to the people who interfaced with the consumer. I wanted to find out what did they like and what didn't they like. And it wasn't just about the Levi's brand. Tell me about these other brands. Which is your best selling brand? Which product in that brand is the biggest seller? Because these are the people that really know, right? These are the ones who hear this brand doesn't fit me, or I don't like this color, or this fabric is too heavy. So these are the people that really provide the source. You can read a lot. There's a lot of information, trade press, etc. But there's no substitution for actually being on the front
Right.
lines, if you will. And so it's taking in a lot of information and synthesizing that information and looking for the strategic nuggets that come out of that.
Right. No, no, that makes a lot of sense. And Tom, I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about the second part of your fascinating journey, which is really public service. And I have to understand that for both the motivation, but also the job itself, being a mayor of a city in California, serving on the board of various organizations, why do that? Why leave 34 years as an executive at Levi's and then transition to being a mayor?
So another interesting story. While I was at Levi's, I did a lot of volunteer work outside of the company. And one of the jobs that I had was president of the Hillsborough Schools Foundation. It was a foundation that raised money to supplement the finances of our schools because we weren't getting enough money from the state. California has always had a little difficulty giving enough money to education. Um, when I retired, I got a call about 3 months later from somebody who had served on the school board while I was president of the foundation and who was now on the city council and said, I'd like to talk to you. We had lunch. He said, there's going to be an opening on the city council. We think you should run for city council. Um, I was a little surprised, but I came home and I talked about it with my wife. And I decided, well, let me go to a couple of city council meetings and see what goes on there. And I did. And then I talked to the person, the woman who was leaving the position. And I decided, okay, my wife's a teacher. She knew she was going to teach at least 4 more years. That's interesting. That's what the term is, 4 years. So I thought, well, I've worked in the private sector. I've also worked in the nonprofit sector. Let me work in the third sector of the economy, which is public service. So I decided to run and got elected and joined the city council, and then, as you said, became a 2-time mayor. It was a fascinating experience. The biggest thing I learned is that it moves at a glacial pace. I couldn't believe how slowly things happen. And in the beginning, it caused me some difficulty because I kept pushing and I wanted to move faster. But eventually you get into the rhythm of a business and you begin to understand the complexities. But you could bring a lot of what you learned from the for-profit world into the private sector. In fact, they're hungry for it. And so I was on a number of county boards and regional boards. I chaired a couple of them. And as you said, I was elected mayor twice. And it was a very interesting experience, and one that I enjoyed for 12 years, but then that was
Amazing.
enough.
How do you deal with the glacial pace in comparison to, being a president of, divisions within Levi's, where I'm sure that, things might not move as quickly as in a startup, but they're still moving quick enough to adapt to the market, and the market is dictating the speed. How do you adapt, even emotionally to be a leader in a glacial paced, environment?
Well, it's interesting because at Levi's, I looked at the women's wear business as a startup. I mean, I really had to restart that business. It was hemorrhaging money like crazy, and in a relatively short time, I was able to make it the third biggest profit contributor into the company. I say I, but it wasn't I. It was we. All the time, it was we. Hiring good people is the key to success, I think, in any place. So I should be using we, not I. And it requires that you have to adapt and adjust to the timing. You can push it a little. You can have an influence, but because of laws and various requirements coming out of the state or federal government, there's some things, some steps that could not be short-circuited. And you
Right.
had to accept that. So you had to look at where can I have the greatest influence? Where can I help people make progress and attack those areas? And you adjust your own, you calibrate yourself so that you don't get frustrated along the way. In public service, everybody has a voice, and you have to listen to all the voices. You don't necessarily have to do what they say, but you have to
Right.
listen to them, and they have to feel listened to. And then the importance of building consensus, very, very important in government work if you want to get anything done.
100%. Tom, I want to thank you for being so generous and so thoughtful during these 20 minutes. I think we're going to have to do another, at least an episode or two, to cover, some of the fun stories that we didn't get a chance to talk about. And I think that it's just remarkable. Both I think, getting a chance to speak to somebody who's had the senior executive role for so many years at such a fascinating company. And I know so little about retail and apparel and fashion that I'm excited to learn more from your journey. But I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And before we leave, I have to ask you for 3 words that you would use to describe yourself.
Ooh, 3 words. Okay, I'll give you the 3 C's.
All right.
Curious, continuous learning, and compassionate.
I love that. Tom, thank you very, very much. Toda rabba. And stay safe and stay healthy.
You too, Michael. I've really enjoyed this. Have a good holiday, and let's all look forward to a much better 2021.